I want to do that by singing a little song. Now, don't get nervous, because we're going to sing this a cappella. And the song, I think you know it. If you don't, it's on page 29 in that little folder there. It's a little song called "Surely the Presence of the Lord is in this place." And I want us to sing that song. Maybe we need to rehearse it once and then we'll sing it for real. But just and as we take the Spirit of God into our hearts and our lives, let's just sing that little song and that little chorus. Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. And I'll try not to pitch it too weird. Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. I can feel His mighty power and His grace. I can hear the rush of angels' wings. I see glory on each face. Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. Surely the presence of the Lord is in our spirit and in our very soul as we stand before God in such a way as to lift up each other and to experience together the loving presence of God. Simon Peter came from the back of the group. Now, most of the time we think of old Simon as being pretty rambunctious and kind of brash, and he's always just kind of runs out and shoots off his mouth before he thinks, a lot like some other people that we may know. But this time I think Simon was rather subdued. Now this is a loose translation, so scholars don't mess with me on this. I want to tell you what I think, how I think this went. Jesus asked the disciples, what are people saying in the highways, the byways of life? And they said, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the other prophets. And then Jesus said, well, who do you say that I am? And it got really quiet. And old Simon stepped from the rear of the crowd. And he said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. The end of that story is that Jesus told Simon, from this time forward, you will be Petros, Peter the rock. And on this rock, I will build my church. And the gates of death, or the gates of Hades, that's a good Greek word, will not prevail against it. The gates of death itself will not overcome it. Old Bishop Goodson out in Virginia used to say that the pallbearers for 1,500 years have been stretching on their white gloves trying to take the church out of existence because whatever it was supposed to do, it had already done, but for some reason it just won't die. Just won't die. I was thinking the other day about this and what I wanted to share with you this morning. And I was thinking about the church as it was when I was a kid. And how different it is from the church in which I find myself today. Back in the old days, back in the 40s and the 50s when I was growing up, church was a lot different than it is now. It was a place where we went and we listened to what the preacher had to say, which usually had something to do with how much we had all sinned and what a terrible bunch of people we were and all this kind of stuff. And we had this wall built around the building where only a certain type of people were welcome in that place. And I'm not being critical of that because that's what the church was back in the 1940s and the 1950s and even up into the early 60s. There was not a lot of joy. At least I didn't think there was a lot of joy in the church, especially in the summer. Down where I come from, summer starts the end of February And it goes until Thanksgiving. It never ends. That's why I'm a little nervous when spring comes, because I know it's going to lead to summer. And I have to remind myself, this is not the same place. This is not the same kind of summer you've dealt with before. But back in those days, summer was long. There was no air conditioning. People sat in the sanctuary listening to the preacher drone on, or rather, he was teaching us and leading us in what he wanted us to know. The windows were thrown up as high as they would go. There were big fans that sounded like a B-36 coming through the sanctuary. It was an interesting time. And it was a time when I, as a kid, 7 or 8 years old perhaps, really wished that I were somewhere else. Now I know that you all, some of you may have experienced that as well. There was not a lot of levity in the church back in those days. Oh, every now and then something would happen that would kind of brighten things up a little bit. One day, we, for some reason, weren't able to go to the church that we normally went to. And we were living in the shadow. I grew up on College Hill in Texarkana, Arkansas. We were living in the shadow of College Hill Methodist Church. And I always wondered, why don't we drive all the way across town to get to church? We got a perfectly good one right there, and all of my friends go to church there. Well, one Sunday we went back. We do that every now and then. If for some reason my grandparents couldn't go, and they always came by and picked us up, and for one reason they couldn't go. So we went back one day to College Hill Methodist Church. It was built on what they call the Akron style. The old big square room with a pulpit in the corner, facing out, angling out into the congregation. The pews were in a sweeping arc around that pulpit. The pulpit was here, the choir was here. And in the middle was the piano, and my Aunt Louise played the piano at College Hill Methodist Church. And so in the middle between all that was Aunt Louise. One Sunday morning, especially a hot Sunday morning, I was sitting there thinking, well, you know, can I crawl out this window? Can I do anything? It's a little relief. And the preacher was teaching. The windows were raised high. Dessa Valentine was sitting in the soprano section of the choir. Dessa was a very prim and proper lady, and she was sitting there with her choir robe all pressed, all the pleats just sharp, and her little white collar, not a stain on it. Her hair was immaculate. Her makeup was just perfect. And she was sitting there thinking about what's in the oven at home, and am I going to get home in time before it burns? The windows were high. Big old stained glass windows were raised high. And as I watched, through the window next to the choir came a big red wasp. Well, that wasp is like he was, you know, he was swinging around there. Sometimes he'd just hang in the air like he's suspended by a string, and he'd swoop down, he'd go around the circle of the preacher's head, he'd go out across the congregation. I thought once he was going to fly out the window right by me, but he didn't. He turned and came back in. Circled around, went down to the choir, circled around some more, and he landed on top of Dessa Valentine's head. And she didn't know it. Clyde Valentine, her husband, sat directly behind her. Clyde was our postman. Everybody loved Clyde, and Clyde loved everybody. That wasp landed on Dessa's head. And Clyde made the worst decision he's ever made. He reached up and he thumped that wasp. Went straight up in the air. Dessa ducked because she felt him thump her hair, and that wasp went right down her back, and church was over. And I tried so hard not to be joyous about it. Dessa was in pain. I don't think there's anybody, if there's still anybody that was there that day, could not tell you one thing the preacher said. But they will always remember Clyde reaching up and thumping that wasp and ending church that day. So there were some things that came along and brightened things up a little bit. A little bit later on in life, I find myself grown and ready to leave home. And I went to Marshall, Texas, where I went to work for the radio station. I'd stay down there 12 or 13 years. I would wind up being there. And I became a part of the first United Methodist Church in Marshall because they didn't have a Presbyterian church. So there I was, the Methodist church. And it was in that church that I answered the call to ministry. And I've been listening to that call all my life. But finally, in that place, I felt something very strong pulling me to answer that call. So I did. Went to school, seminary, graduate school, all that stuff. Got really, really smart. And I came out and began what we call in the United Methodist Church the itineracy, where we had to move around. They move us around, put us in different places. And I had a dream of a congregation that I wanted to create. A dream of a congregation that I wanted to see happen. But unfortunately, I was the only one that seemed to have that vision and that dream. So I went through nearly 40 years of sometimes it was frustrating. Sometimes it could be really close. Then the next time it would be far, far away. But I never was able to be a part and to create the congregation that I had envisioned, that I had in my mind. And I was going back to the second chapter of Acts, and I want to share this little short passage of Scripture with you from the second chapter of Acts, beginning with the 42nd verse and going down through the 47th verse. And this is a New International Version. And this is the only glimpse that we have of what the early church was like. The only thing that we have that tells us what the church was like in its beginning and what the church was, I think, intended to be. But listen to this description. They, meaning the people who found themselves a part of that church, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being made new. I translated that last word. I don't care for that. But anyway, you see what I mean. If you take that and you set that down and you make that the church, there's no barrier on the outside to determine who is free to come in and who is free not to, who is not free to come in. There's no wall between people. One of the most amazing things I've heard in a long time is welcome and affirming. Because you know what that means to me? That means to me that there are no barriers of any kind between people. You take that literally and say this is a welcoming and affirming congregation or group of people or community. There are no barriers. Well, you know, I spent a lot of years. I spent nearly 40 years in local church ministry, going from one place to another. And in my mind was always that dream, a dream of a congregation where people were not only invited to, but encouraged to be themselves. Where people were encouraged to be who they were intended to be, not who I thought they ought to be. And lo and behold, I wind up plump right in the middle of this community. And guess what I find in this community? I find that congregation that I've always dreamed about, that congregation that I've always envisioned, coming in here from it's sort of like coming in here from another culture. Coming in here from another culture, I see a community of people, yet people being invited to be individuals. A community filled with individuals. Imagine that. Community filled with individuals. A community in which the soul of God. Now, I love the old ancient Celtic idea that, now I get in lots of trouble for this sometimes. At least I used to. Maybe I won't this time. I love the old ancient Celtic idea that rather than each of us individually being a soul unto ourselves, we're all a part of the soul of God. Does that make sense? We're all a part of the soul of God which fills all things, which fills all of us. And in that soul, when we fill ourselves with that soul and allow that soul to be seen in us, God's love comes forth naturally. Not something we have to learn to do or be trained in, but something rather that is natural. Several years ago, a young man who was a pastor of a big mega church wrote a book. And it was absolutely, I've never seen a book stir things up the way that one did. And I thought, that's probably a pretty good book. If it's going to stir up that much controversy, I probably should read that book. And I read it, and I don't know what the fuss was about. Because all he was saying was that love wins. Love wins. That's it. Now, why would that be controversial? Why would it be controversial to say, yes, love wins? And the love of God is contained within each of us, not just coming screaming down from someplace, pouring over us and making us all mellow and all that. But the love of God is within us. And you know what that means? Well, of course you do. That means to me that we are all in this together. And it doesn't make any difference what our ethnic background is, what our orientation is. Nothing matters except the fact that we contain within us and we share among ourselves the love of God. This scripture from the Acts of the Apostles says that every day they continued to meet together in temple courts. They broke bread in their homes. They ate together, glad, sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were made whole. All the believers were together. They took everything that they had and they got rid of it to share among all the people. It didn't say the people in their group. It says all the people. All the people. Now that is welcoming and affirming, at least to me. It's a joy to watch this happen among people. It's a joy to realize that whether we understand or say it like this or not, but in our hearts and in our lives, in this place, in this community of faith, love is the principle. Love is the thing. Love is the center. Has to be. The church of today, at least this, the church, and we see in various communities, church of today is a lot different than it was back in 1947, 8, 9, 10, 47, 8, 9, 1950, 60. It's a lot different than it was then. There's more joy. There's more acceptance of each other. There's more presence of God's love among us than there used to be. At least in the mainline denominations. Because you see, love wins every time. Love wins every time when we reach out and we touch one another with love, and we reach out from beyond, from inside the soul of God, and we bring others into that soul. Well, that's the kind of the group that I've been thinking about. That's the kind of community of faith that I have dreamed about and envisioned. Maybe it wasn't time yet. Maybe it wasn't time yet. Because the church was as it was in those days. The church is as it is in these days. And as we look on down the road for, my goodness, 60 years. Oh my goodness, that's been a long time ago. 60 years. We look down the road to the next 60 years. What will the church be then? What will the church be then? Maybe we will have even focused our attention more clearly on this idea of love winning. Maybe we will have focused our attention more clearly on the idea that we are all one. We are all part of the soul of God. So, you know, there are a lot of people out there that say, oh yeah, the church is done for. I mean, because it's not like it was when I was growing up. And frankly, that's okay with me. I don't have a problem with it. But there are a lot of people who feel like that the church has lost whatever it had. But as old Bishop Goodson said, again, say one word to the pallbearers, take off the gloves, and sit down. The church is not dead. The church will never die because the church is built on a rock, and the gates of death will never, never prevail against it. So be it.